They had already decided where I would live. I heard my daughter say it in the kitchen in that careful voice people use when they think they're being kind. "It's for the best," she whispered. "Mom can't stay alone in that house." I was standing in the hallway with a basket of laundry pressed against my chest. The cotton smelled faintly of lavender detergent. My hands were still damp from folding towels. For a moment I thought they were talking about someone else, but then my son replied, low and firm. "We'll sell the house in spring. Prices are good. The equity will cover the assisted living place near me." Sell the house Frank built with his own hands. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. I just stood there, listening to my children rearrange my life as if it were a piece of furniture. Frank had been gone for 7 months. 7 months since the hospital room with its steady, heartless beeping. 7 months since I held his hand and felt the warmth leave it slowly, like the sun sinking behind a hill. After 42 years of marriage, silence became my loudest companion. I was 65 when he passed. I did not feel fragile. I felt hollow. There is a difference. The house felt too big without him. The clock ticked louder. The refrigerator hummed at night like it was trying to comfort me. Sometimes I would wake up and reach across the bed out of habit, only to touch cold sheets. But it was still my home. The maple tree in the yard still dropped leaves across the lawn Frank once raked in neat rows. The kitchen still carried the faint scent of his morning coffee, dark roast, always too strong for me. His workshop in the garage still held jars of nails organized by size, each labeled in his steady handwriting. I had not touched those jars. I was not ready. Apparently my children were. I set the laundry basket down quietly and stepped into the kitchen. My daughter Blakely jumped a little when she saw me. She had inherited my eyes but not my stillness. She filled silence quickly, nervously. "Oh, Mom, we were just talking." My son Daniel stood by the counter with his arms folded. He had Frank's jawline and that same way of squinting when he thought he was being practical. "Talking about me?" I asked. I kept my voice calm. Calm has always been my armor. Blakely rushed toward me, touching my arm. "We're worried about you, that's all." "You shouldn't be alone here." Alone, such a heavy word. "I've lived here for 38 years, I said. "I know where every creak in this floor comes from." Daniel exhaled. "Mom, this isn't about creaks, it's about safety. What if you fall? What if something happens?" "What if nothing happens?" I replied softly. They exchanged a look, that silent conversation children have when they believe they are more rational than their parents. "We've been looking at a place," Blakely continued. "It's lovely, activities, other people your age, you'd make friends." Friends. As if loneliness were solved by scheduled bingo nights. "In the house?" I asked. Daniel answered without hesitation. "It's too much for one person, it makes sense to sell." Makes sense. There it was, the language of decision already finished. I walked to the window and looked at the backyard. The grass needed trimming. Frank used to mow every Saturday morning. The smell of fresh-cut grass would drift into the kitchen while I scrambled eggs. "Did you ask me?" I said, still facing the yard. Blakely's voice softened. "We're asking now?" "No, I thought you're informing me now, but I did not say that." Instead, I nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." Daniel looked relieved, as if a negotiation had been won. They stayed for dinner. I made pot roast the way Frank liked it, though no one commented on that. The gravy simmered too long while my mind wandered. The clinking of forks against plates sounded louder than usual. After they left, I washed the dishes in silence. The kitchen light flickered slightly. It had been doing that for months. Frank always meant to fix it. I dried my hands and walked into the living room. His recliner sat by the lamp, untouched. The indent in the cushion had faded, but I could still see where his shoulders used to rest. "They're just worried," I whispered to the empty room, but worry can sometimes wear the face of control. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt different, as if it had overheard everything and was waiting for my answer. Sell the house, move into a place with beige walls and scheduled meals, be safe, be manageable, be smaller. I stared at the ceiling and felt something stir inside me, not anger, not yet, something steadier, a quiet resistance. Frank and I had planned our retirement carefully. We paid off the mortgage early, we saved, we talked about traveling, maybe not far, but enough. He used to say, when I'm gone, you make sure you keep living, Margaret, don't shrink. I had laughed when he said that. You're not going anywhere, I told him. Life rarely asks for permission. The next morning I made coffee, lighter roast, the way I prefer it. I carried the mug to the porch and sat in the cool air. The sun was just rising, soft and pale. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to imagine something other than grief, not an assisted living apartment, not a quiet surrender, but something else. I didn't know exactly what yet, only this: my children believed they were making plans for me. They never asked what plans I had for myself, and that would be their first surprise. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the warmth settle in my chest. They thought they were protecting me, they never expected my answer. The next week they started coming over more often, not together, separately, as if dividing the responsibility made it lighter. Blakely came on Tuesday with a casserole I did not ask for. Daniel came Thursday evening with a folder tucked under his arm. I noticed everything. The way Blakely looked around the living room as if measuring it with her eyes. The way Daniel stood in the hallway staring at the ceiling corners like he was inspecting for cracks. They weren't visiting. They were assessing. On Tuesday, Blakely placed the casserole dish on the counter and hugged me tightly, a little too tightly. How are you feeling today, Mom? I feel like it's Tuesday, I said gently. She smiled, but her eyes stayed serious. We sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table Frank and I bought secondhand when Daniel was born. There's a scratch on the edge from when Blakely tried to carve her name into it at 7 years old. I keep that scratch. It reminds me that children grow. Mom, she began, stirring her tea without drinking it. I spoke to someone at Maple Grove. Maple Grove, I repeated. The assisted living place near Daniel's house. They have a 1-bedroom available. It's bright, big windows. I have big windows, I said. She exhaled softly. I know. The clock above the stove ticked steadily. I watched her hands. They were restless, like when she was young and trying to tell me she broke something. We just want you somewhere safe, she said. You shouldn't have to mow the lawn or worry about repairs. I've hired Mr. Jenkins' grandson to mow, I replied. He's 16, he needs the money. She hesitated. What about the stairs? She pressed. You go up and down them every day. I've been using stairs since before you were born. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just heavy. Are you afraid for me? I asked finally. She looked startled. Of course I am. Or are you afraid of something else? Her lips parted slightly. She did not answer. Later that evening, after she left, I walked through the house slowly. I let my fingers trail along the banister. I paused in the doorway of our bedroom. I was not blind to reality. 65 is not young. My knees ache some mornings. My back stiffens if I sit too long. Grief makes everything heavier. But I was not incapable. On Thursday, Daniel arrived with that folder. He didn't bother sitting right away. He spread papers across the kitchen counter. Mom, I've done some research. I poured him coffee. He prefers it black like Frank did. The market is strong right now, he continued. If we list in April, we could get well above asking. That money could be invested. It would give you security. Security? I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. And what makes you think I don't have security? He looked uncomfortable. Dad handled most of the finances. Yes, I said. He did, and when he got sick 2 years ago, he taught me everything. Daniel blinked. I know where every account is, I continued calmly. I know how much we have. I know what the pension pays monthly. I know the insurance policies. He stared at me as if I had just spoken another language. You never said. You never asked. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the quiet. I'm not trying to take control, he said after a moment. I just don't want you to struggle. I am not struggling. He softened then. I saw the little boy who once cried because he scraped his knee and thought the world was ending. Mom, he said quietly, when Dad died, something changed. You stopped calling as much. You stopped coming over. Grief isolates in ways no one prepares you for. I needed time, I said. That doesn't mean I was falling apart. He looked down at the papers. We thought, he began, then stopped. What did you think? That you'd eventually need help. And it's easier to make a plan early. A plan, always a plan. I walked to the window again. The maple tree was bare now, winter having stripped it clean. Its branches looked fragile against the gray sky. "Did it occur to you," I said slowly, "that I might have plans of my own?" He was quiet for a long time. "No," he admitted. That honesty almost made me smile. After he left, I didn't sleep again. Instead, I went into Frank's workshop. I hadn't stepped in there properly since the funeral. The air smelled like sawdust and motor oil. His old radio sat on the shelf, silent. I ran my hand over the workbench. There were faint burn marks from soldering, a small coffee ring near the edge. On the wall, pinned above the bench, was a sheet of paper in his handwriting. Retirement projects. Underneath were simple things. Build bookshelf for Margaret, fix porch railing, take train trip up the coast, start community garden, start community garden. I stared at that line for a long time. We had talked about it one night in bed, the rain tapping softly against the windows. "There's that empty lot on Maple Street," Frank had said. "It'd be good for vegetables. Kids these days don't know how to grow anything." I laughed. "And you're going to teach them? Why not?" I had forgotten that conversation, or maybe I buried it. The next morning, I did something my children would not expect. I called the town office. The woman on the line sounded surprised when I asked about the vacant lot on Maple Street. "It's been unused for years," she said. "There was talk about development, but nothing happened." "Is it available for community use?" I asked. "Well, possibly. You'd have to submit a proposal." A proposal? I had never written one in my life, but I had written grocery lists, Christmas cards, school permission slips, and condolence notes. I had balanced a checkbook for 4 decades. I had held a household together. How different could a proposal be? That afternoon, I cleared the dining table. I gathered Frank's old folders, my bank statements, a notebook. The house felt different, not like it was waiting for my answer, but like it was listening to my decision. My children thought the safest future for me was smaller, quieter, contained. But as I sat there with a pen in my hand, I felt something expand inside me, not rebellion, purpose. I did not want to prove them wrong out of spite. I wanted to prove myself right. When Blakely called that evening, I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom." "Daniel said you seemed defensive yesterday." "I wasn't defensive," I replied gently. "I was thinking." "About Maple Grove?" "No." There was a pause. "About what then?" "About the fact that your father and I saved carefully, about the fact that this house is paid for. About the fact that I am still capable of making decisions." She was quiet, and she asked, "And I'm not ready to leave." Her breath hitched slightly. "Mom, I'm not saying never," I continued. "I'm saying not now, but what if something happens?" "If something happens, we'll address it then." "That's not how planning works," she said softly. "It is how living works." Silence again. "I need you to trust me," I said, her voice softened. "I'm just scared, I know." And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. They weren't just planning my future. They were trying to control their fear, fear of losing another parent, fear of watching me age, fear of helplessness, but fear is a poor architect. I hung up the phone and looked at the notebook on the table. On the first page, I wrote, "Maple Street Community Garden Proposal." My handwriting trembled slightly, not from weakness, from anticipation. They thought my life was narrowing. They did not see that it was about to widen. And they certainly did not expect that my answer to their careful plans would be something entirely my own. I didn't tell them about the garden, not yet. Some dreams are too fragile in the beginning. They need quiet soil before they're exposed to weather. Instead, I moved slowly, carefully. I walked to the Maple Street lot 3 days later. It was only 4 blocks from my house. I had passed it dozens of times without truly seeing it. Up close, it looked forgotten. Weeds tangled across the ground like uncombed hair. A rusted chain-link fence leaned slightly to one side. Someone had dumped old tires near the back corner. The winter wind carried the faint smell of damp earth and decay. It was not beautiful, but it was not dead either. I stood there for a long time, my hands tucked into my coat pockets. The sky hung low and gray. A crow landed near the fence, pecking at something invisible. Frank would have seen possibility immediately. I saw work. Work did not scare me. What scared me was shrinking. The following week, I attended a town council meeting for the first time in my life. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. Folding chairs lined the back wall. Most people there were younger than me, tapping at their phones while they waited for their turn to speak. When my name was called, I stood slowly. "My name is Margaret Collins," I began. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I've lived on Pine Street for 38 years. A few heads lifted. "I'm here to ask about the unused lot on Maple Street. I'd like permission to turn it into a community garden." There was a murmur. One of the council members, a man with silver hair and reading glasses, leaned forward. "Do you have a proposal?" I held up the folder I had assembled over 2 sleepless nights. It contained sketches, rough, imperfect drawings of raised beds, a small tool shed, a bench along the fence. I had even calculated approximate costs using prices from the hardware store. "I do." They asked questions. Who would maintain it? What about liability? Who would fund it? Each question felt less like an obstacle and more like a doorway. "I would maintain it," I answered. "At least to begin with. I'm prepared to invest my own savings to get it started." That last part surprised even me, but it was true. Frank and I had saved for travel. He was gone. The money remained. What use is savings if it only waits for fear? The silver-haired councilman nodded slowly. "We'll review your proposal and get back to you." When I left the meeting, the air felt sharper. My cheeks were flushed. I hadn't felt that kind of nervous energy in years. It wasn't about the garden, it was about being seen. The following Sunday, Daniel came over again. He brought brochures this time. Glossy photographs of smiling seniors seated around tables, watercolor paintings on the walls, nurses in pastel uniforms. "Maple Grove has an opening in May," he said, spreading the brochure across the coffee table. "We should secure it before someone else does." I sat across from him in Frank's recliner. He noticed that. "Mom, I like this chair," I said calmly. "It fits me." He sighed. "You're avoiding the conversation." "No," I replied, "I'm living in it." He rubbed his temples. "Why are you being so stubborn?" There it was, stubborn. As if independence were a personality flaw. "Do you know what your father used to say when you were 10? I asked quietly. He frowned. "What? You wanted to quit baseball because you weren't the best player." He shifted in his seat. "Frank told you being uncomfortable doesn't mean you should leave. It might mean you should grow." Daniel stared at the floor. "This house is uncomfortable right now," I continued. "It echoes, it reminds me of him, but leaving because it's uncomfortable isn't growth, it's escape." He looked up at me then, and I saw frustration but also confusion. "What are you planning?" he asked suddenly. That question lingered in the air. Planning. They assumed my resistance meant denial. They did not imagine initiative. "I'm thinking about a project," I said carefully. "What kind of project?" "One that requires me to stay." His jaw tightened. "Mom, you don't need a project, you need support." "I have support. You have memories. And you have fear," I replied gently. That landed harder than I expected. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. "I already lost Dad," he said quietly. "I can't lose you too." Something inside me softened. I rose and placed my hand on his shoulder. "You're not losing me," I whispered. "I'm still here, I just refuse to disappear early." He didn't answer, but he didn't argue either. The call from the town council came 2 weeks later. They approved a trial permit. 6 months. If I could gather community interest and maintain the space, the project could become permanent. I hung up the phone and laughed, a sound that startled even me. I hadn't laughed like that since before the hospital room. The next morning I stood in the Maple Street lot with a pair of gloves and a thermos of coffee. The ground was stubborn. Roots tangled beneath the surface. My back protested after the first hour. Dirt worked its way under my fingernails, but with every weed I pulled, something loosened inside me. Grief does not vanish, it shifts. Mrs. Hernandez from 2 streets over stopped by mid-morning. "What are you doing out here?" She called. "Starting something," I replied. She leaned on the fence watching me. "By yourself, for now." She studied the lot, then me. "My husband used to garden," she said after a moment. "I haven't touched the soil since he passed." "Bring your gloves tomorrow," I said. She hesitated, then nodded. Word spread slowly. A young mother came by with her daughter. A retired teacher offered to donate tools. Even Mr. Jenkins' grandson asked if he could help after school. I didn't advertise, I simply worked. And people noticed. Blakely came over one evening and found my boots by the door caked in mud. "What have you been doing?" she asked. "Planting," I said. "In February, preparing." She followed me into the kitchen. "Mom, what's going on?" I poured her tea and finally told her. About the council meeting, about the permit, about the garden. She stared at me as if I had announced I was moving to another country. "You did all that?" she whispered. "Yes. Without telling us, I didn't need permission." Her expression shifted, not anger but disbelief. "Mom, that's a lot of work. I know, you could get hurt. I could also succeed." She sat down slowly. "Why?" she asked. That question was softer than the others. I looked at her, truly looked at her. "Because your father believed in building things," I said quietly, "and because I'm not done building." Her eyes filled with tears. "I thought you were falling apart," she admitted. "I was," I said, "for a while. But falling apart is not the same as being finished." That night after she left, I stood at the kitchen window again. The house no longer felt like a waiting room. It felt like headquarters. My children had started making plans for me out of fear. But fear had underestimated me. The garden was small, the permit temporary, my knees ached. But something steady had taken root, and they still did not understand what my answer truly meant. Not yet. Spring came slowly that year, the kind of spring that hesitates. Cold mornings, thin sunlight. Soil that resists your shovel before finally giving in. By March, the Maple Street lot no longer looked abandoned. It looked possible. Mrs. Hernandez arrived every morning at 9 sharp, wearing a wide straw hat that made her look 10 years younger. She didn't speak much at first. She worked quietly, carefully, like someone reacquainting herself with something sacred. Mr. Jenkins' grandson, Tyler, built the first raised bed under my direction. He measured twice, cut once, just like Frank used to insist. "You sure you know what you're doing, Mrs. Collins?" he asked one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead. "No," I said honestly, "but I'm learning." He grinned. "Guess that makes 2 of us." Little by little, the lot transformed. We hauled away the tires, we straightened the fence, we spread fresh soil. I used part of our savings to purchase lumber and seeds, tomatoes, green beans, lettuce, cucumbers. Each seed felt like a quiet declaration. I am still here. But while the garden began to grow, so did the tension at home. Daniel stopped by one Saturday unannounced. He stood at the edge of the lot watching us work, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "You've recruited half the neighborhood," he said when I walked over. "I didn't recruit anyone," I replied. "They came." He surveyed the raised beds, the small wooden sign Tyler had painted, Maple Street Garden. "This isn't just a hobby, is it?" he asked. "No." He studied me carefully. "You're trying to prove something." "Maybe," I said. "To who?" I held his gaze. "To myself." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked along the fence, examining the space. "It's impressive," he admitted finally, "but it's also a lot." "It is. And what happens when winter comes again, when it's too cold, when your back gives out?" His questions weren't cruel, they were practical, but practicality can be suffocating when it leaves no room for faith. "When that happens," I said calmly, "I will adjust." He shook his head slightly. "You've always been stubborn, and you've always been cautious." He almost smiled at that. "I just don't want this to be a distraction," he said. "It's not," I replied softly. "It's direction." That evening, Blakely called. "Daniel said you're out there every day." "I am." "You sound different," she said. "How alive." The word surprised me, alive. "Yes," I said quietly, "I suppose I do." There was a long pause. "Mom," she began carefully, "Daniel and I had a meeting with a real estate agent last week." My chest tightened slightly. "You what?" "We haven't signed anything," she rushed to clarify. "We just wanted to know options." Options they were still planning without me. "You met with an agent about my house?" I asked. "We thought it would be smart to be prepared." "Prepared for what?" "For when you finally agree," she said softly. There it was. Not if, when. I felt something shift inside me, not anger, but clarity. "Blakely," I said gently, "you're preparing for a version of me that doesn't exist." She inhaled sharply. "We're trying to protect you." "From what?" "From being alone, from making a mistake. From losing control." "I haven't lost control." "But Dad trusted me," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. Silence. "Your father and I talked about everything before he passed," I continued. He did not raise you to manage me." She sounded small when she answered, "We just don't know what to do with our worry." And suddenly I understood. Their planning wasn't about money or convenience, it was about grief. They had lost him too, and instead of sitting with that loss, they were trying to organize it. If they could move me into a safe, structured environment, maybe nothing else would fall apart. But life does not bend simply because we arrange it neatly. "I need you to trust that I am not fragile," I said softly. "Sad, yes, older, yes, but not fragile." After we hung up, I walked into the living room and sat in Frank's recliner again. The cushion had molded slightly to my shape now. The house felt quieter than it once did, but not empty. Outside, I could hear distant laughter from the street, children riding bicycles. A dog barking, life continuing. 2 weeks later, something happened that none of us expected. The local newspaper ran a small story about the Maple Street garden. A picture of me standing beside the raised beds, dirt on my gloves, hair pulled back in a loose clip. The headline read, "Widow transforms vacant lot into community garden." Widow. I stared at that word for a long time. It was accurate, but it did not define me. The phone rang nonstop that day. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years offered donations. A local hardware store provided discounted supplies. Even the town council member with silver hair stopped by to shake my hand. "This is exactly what we hoped for," he said. When Daniel saw the article, he came over that evening. He didn't mention Maple Grove, he didn't mention real estate. He simply stood in the doorway holding the newspaper. "I didn't realize it was this big," he said quietly. "It isn't big," I replied. "It's local. That's still big." He walked through the house slowly as if seeing it differently. "You've been busy," he said. "I have." He stopped in the kitchen and looked at me. "I thought you were fading," he admitted. I met his eyes. "I was grieving." He nodded slowly. "They're not the same thing, are they?" "No," I said, "they're not." We sat at the table together, no brochures, no folders, just tea. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "About meeting with the agent, we should have talked to you first." "Yes," I said gently, "you should have." He looked ashamed. "I guess I didn't think you'd do something like this." "What did you think I would do?" "Slow down, retreat, maybe move closer to one of us." "I may still slow down someday," I said, "but it will be my decision." He nodded, and for the first time since Frank passed, I felt like my son saw me not as a responsibility, but as a person. Yet the tension was not fully gone, because while Daniel was beginning to understand, Blakely still feared the worst, and fear has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. That summer, as the first tomatoes ripened on the vine, my body reminded me of its age. I bent too quickly one morning and felt a sharp pain shoot across my lower back. I had to sit down in the dirt, breathing slowly until it passed. Mrs. Hernandez rushed over. "You need to rest," she insisted. "I will," I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. For the first time, doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if this was too much? What if independence had an expiration date? That night I lay awake again, not from grief, but from uncertainty. The house was quiet. The clock ticked, and I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. Was I building something sustainable or simply delaying the inevitable? The pain in my back lingered longer than I wanted to admit. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't send me to the hospital. It simply stayed, a quiet reminder every time I bent down or lifted a bag of soil. That frightened me more than anything my children had said. Because fear spoken by others can be resisted. Fear whispered by your own body is harder to ignore. For 3 days I stayed home. I told Mrs. Hernandez I needed to organize paperwork. That was only half a lie. I did sort through documents, insurance policies, bank statements, Frank's old tool receipts, but mostly I sat at the kitchen table listening to the house breathe around me. The stillness felt different this time, not hollow, questioning. On the second evening, Blakely came by unannounced. She must have sensed the pause. She found me in the living room with a heating pad across my lower back. "What happened?" she asked immediately, her voice tightening. "Nothing serious," I said calmly. "I moved too quickly." She knelt in front of me, her hands warm on mine. "This is what we're afraid of, Mom." "I know," the words surprised her. "You know?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I'm not immune to reality." She studied my face, searching for something, maybe denial. You don't have to prove anything, she whispered. I'm not proving, I replied. I'm living. She exhaled slowly. You scared me when you didn't answer your phone yesterday. I was napping. You never nap. I smiled faintly. Maybe I should start. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that no longer feels hostile. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Of course. Are you afraid? The question was soft, honest. Yes, I admitted. She blinked as if she hadn't expected that. I'm afraid of becoming invisible, I continued. Of being handled instead of heard, of waking up one day in a place I didn't choose. Her eyes filled. We would never make you invisible. You already tried to. She flinched, not from accusation but recognition. We thought we were helping, I know, and we still think you need support. I do, I said gently, just not surrender. That word hung between us. Surrender. The following week I returned to the gardens, slower this time. I brought a small folding chair and forced myself to sit between tasks. Tyler carried heavier supplies. Mrs. Hernandez insisted on handling the watering hose. I began delegating. That was new for me. For decades, I ran a household where asking for help felt like weakness. Frank used to tease me about it. You don't have to do everything, Margaret, he'd say, leaning against the kitchen doorway. But I did, or I thought I did. Now I learned something different. Independence does not mean isolation. One afternoon, while I was seated under the shade of the maple tree near the fence, Daniel arrived again. He didn't look tense this time. He looked thoughtful. I've been thinking, he said, sitting beside me on the overturned crate we used as a stool. That's usually how trouble starts, I teased lightly. He smiled. I met with a financial advisor at work, he continued. Not about selling the house. I raised an eyebrow, about how to make sure you're secure without uprooting everything. I waited. There are ways to structure things, he said. Home equity lines, emergency funds, medical alerts, support systems. Support systems, I repeated. Yes, without moving you. The breeze rustled the leaves above us. You've been researching alternatives? I asked. He nodded. I realized something, he said quietly. We were solving the wrong problem. And what's the right one? Making sure you're safe without deciding who you are. That landed gently in my chest. It was not an apology exactly. It was growth. I'm not against planning, I told him. I just want to be part of it. You will be, he said firmly. We sat there watching Mrs. Hernandez explain to a little girl how to plant carrot seeds. I didn't understand why you were fighting so hard, he admitted. I wasn't fighting you, I said. I was fighting disappearance. He nodded slowly. I see that now. The tension that had lived between us for months loosened slightly, not gone, but softer. That evening I made dinner for both of them. We sat at the oak table again, the scratched edge still visible. For the first time since Frank passed, the conversation didn't circle around worry. It wandered instead to recipes, to neighborhood news, to the garden's first harvest. At one point, Blakely reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, she said. The words caught me off guard. I'm proud of you too, I replied. For what? For learning. She laughed softly through tears. The public consequence of their early plans had already begun to unfold. Neighbors now greeted me differently, not with pity but with curiosity. The woman who once brought casseroles now brought seedlings. The man who used to offer condolences now offered compost. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer the widow alone in the big house. I was Margaret from the garden, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. Still, one final conversation remained. The real estate agent called, not me, Daniel. He had to explain that the house would not be listed. When he told me about the call, he looked almost sheepish. She was surprised, he said. I imagined she was. I told her my mother had other plans. Other plans, I liked the sound of that. A week later, the town council officially extended the garden permit beyond the trial period. It would become a permanent community space with shared responsibility. I stood at the small ceremony holding a pair of scissors for the ribbon cutting. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from fullness. Daniel stood on my left, Blakely on my right. When the ribbon fell, there was applause, simple, sincere. In that moment, I realized something important. My children had not been my enemies. They had been grieving in their own language, through control, through planning, through overprotection. And I had been grieving in mine, through action, through creation, through refusal. We had all been afraid. But fear no longer drove the conversation. After the ceremony, as the sun dipped low and painted everything gold, Daniel turned to me. "So," he said gently, "what's next?" I smiled. "Now we maintain." He laughed softly. "No grand expansion, growth," I said, "doesn't always mean bigger. Sometimes it means deeper." That night I returned home alone. The house felt different again, not as headquarters this time. As sanctuary, I walked through each room slowly. The workshop no longer felt frozen in time. The living room no longer felt like a museum. It felt lived in, chosen. I paused at the kitchen window, looking out at the darkening yard. They had started making plans for me, plans born from love, yes, but also from fear. They never expected my answer to be rooted in staying, in building, in expanding right where I stood, and I realized something else. My answer had not just surprised them, it had changed them. Summer settled in fully after the ribbon cutting. The tomatoes grew thick and red, heavy on their vines. The cucumbers climbed the trellis Tyler built. Children ran between the beds with dirt-smudged knees and loud, uncomplicated laughter. And for the first time since Frank's funeral, I felt something close to steadiness. Not happiness in the bright, careless sense, but steadiness. The kind that doesn't shake when the phone rings unexpectedly. The kind that allows silence to exist without swallowing you whole. Still, life has a way of testing any piece you build. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the call came. Daniel's voice sounded tight. "Mom, can you sit down?" I was already sitting on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl. "I'm sitting. There was an incident at work. I might lose my job." The words dropped slowly between us. He worked for a logistics company, steady, predictable, or so I thought. What happened? I asked calmly. "There were budget cuts, they're restructuring, my department is under review." "Under review," I repeated. "I won't know for a few weeks." His voice trembled slightly, something I hadn't heard since he was a boy afraid of thunderstorms. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. "For what?" "For pushing you about selling the house. I thought I was being responsible, and now I might not even be able to." "To what?" I asked gently. "To support you if something happened." Ah, there it was, the hidden weight. All those months I had assumed their urgency came from fear of losing me, but it also came from fear of failing me. "Daniel," I said quietly, "you are not my retirement plan." He exhaled sharply. "I know that, but—" "No," I interrupted softly. "Listen to me. Your father and I prepared carefully so you wouldn't have to carry us." Silence. "I don't want to be your burden," he admitted. "You're not, and I didn't want you to become mine." The truth hung there, fragile and honest. "We've been trying to protect each other from things that haven't happened," I said. He let out a shaky laugh. "That sounds like us." "Come for dinner tonight," I told him. "No brochures, no spreadsheets, just dinner." He arrived looking thinner somehow, not physically but emotionally. Stress has a way of shrinking a person from the inside. We ate quietly at first. Then gradually he began to talk about his fears, about feeling behind compared to colleagues, about worrying that if he lost this job he would disappoint everyone. "I'm 42, he said. "I should have everything figured out." I smiled faintly. "I'm 65, I replied, "and I just started a garden from scratch." He looked at me. "Maybe having everything figured out isn't the goal," I continued. "Maybe staying willing is." He studied his plate. "I don't know what I'd do if I lost the house," he said quietly. "If something happened to mine, I mean." The words were almost accidental, but they revealed something I hadn't fully seen. When they talked about selling my home, they weren't just thinking about my safety. They were thinking about contingency, about assets, about security for the entire family, and perhaps about inheritance, not greed, just calculation. "We need to talk about something," I said gently. He looked up. "This house will not be your backup plan." His expression flickered. "I didn't mean." "I know you didn't mean it that way," I interrupted kindly, "but I need you to understand something." I leaned forward slightly. "This house is not a financial cushion. It is my home." He nodded slowly. "And when I'm gone," I continued, "you and Blakely will decide what to do with it, but not before." The air shifted, not confrontational, clarifying. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "I know." The next week, Blakely faced her own storm. Her husband, Mark, received an offer in another state, a promotion that required relocation. She called me in tears. "It's a good opportunity," she said, "but it's far, and if we move, I won't be able to check on you." I almost laughed. "You are not my assigned nurse," I told her gently. "That's not what I mean." "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "I like knowing you're close." There it was again, proximity mistaken for control. "If you move," I said softly, "move because it's right for your family. Not because you think I need supervision." She was quiet for a long moment. "Would you really be okay?" she asked. "I would miss you," I answered honestly. "But I would be okay." The garden had done something none of us anticipated. It had given me visible proof of my capability, not in theory, in action. When neighbors asked for advice on pruning, when the council praised the initiative, when children pointed to me and said, "Mrs. Collins knows where to plant the carrots," something shifted in my children's perception. I was no longer fragile in their eyes, I was functional, and function is harder to manage. 2 weeks later, Daniel called again. "I didn't lose the job," he said. Relief washed through his voice like sunlight. "They cut another department. I'm staying." "That's good news," I said warmly. "But the scare did something," he continued. "What?" "It made me realize how quickly things can change and how much I've been trying to control outcomes." "Control feels safer than trust," I replied. "Yes," he said quietly, "but it's exhausting." We both laughed softly. A few days later, Blakely came over with news of her own. They had accepted the promotion. They were moving in the fall. She expected me to protest, to ask her to stay. I didn't. Instead, I hugged her tightly and said, "I'm proud of you." She pulled back, eyes wide. "You're not upset?" "I raised you to grow," I said, "not to hover." She smiled through tears. "You're stronger than I thought," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "I'm not stronger," I said, "I just stopped shrinking." That evening, after she left, I walked through the house slowly again. The same walls, the same floors, but I felt taller somehow. Not because I had won an argument, not because I had proven them wrong, but because I had reclaimed authorship of my own life. They had started making plans for me. They assumed age meant surrender. They never expected my answer to be expansion, and now something else became clear. My answer had not only protected my independence, it had given them permission to pursue theirs. By the time autumn approached, everything felt different. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just settled. Blakely's house filled slowly with cardboard boxes. She brought the grandchildren over more often, as if storing up familiar corners before they moved. Daniel came by on Sundays without agendas, sometimes just to sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and talk about nothing important. The garden shifted colors. The bright greens of summer softened into deeper shades. The tomato vines thinned. The lettuce beds gave their final harvest. We planted pumpkins near the fence, mostly for the children. One afternoon, as golden leaves drifted across the soil, I stood at the center of the garden and let the quiet wrap around me. Mrs. Hernandez was trimming back her herbs. Tyler was hammering together a small storage bench. A young couple debated whether their peppers were ready to pick. It no longer felt like my project. It felt like ours, and that was the point. I had not built something to prove my strength. I had built something that would outlive my strength. That realization brought an unexpected calm. A few days later, Daniel arrived carrying a small box. "I found this in Dad's workshop," he said, placing it on the kitchen table. Inside were old photographs. Frank at 30 holding Blakely as a baby. Me standing beside Daniel on his first day of school. A picture of the house before the maple tree had grown tall enough to shade the yard. We sat together, flipping through them slowly. "I used to think this house was just a structure," Daniel said quietly. "Walls, an asset." "And now," I asked, "now I see what you see." I studied him carefully. "And what's that?" "A timeline," he replied, "a record of us." The words warmed me more than the tea in my cup. "I'm glad you stayed," he added. "So am I." There was no resentment in his voice now, no urgency, just understanding. Blakely's final week before the move was harder. On her last evening in town, she came alone. No children, no boxes, just her. We sat in the living room with the lamps on low. The house felt especially still, as if listening. "I was wrong," she said abruptly. "About what?" "About thinking you couldn't handle this." I smiled gently. "You weren't wrong to worry, but I was wrong to decide." Her honesty surprised me again. "I thought if we made everything smaller for you, you'd be safer," she continued. "But I realize now you needed room." "Yes," I said softly, "I did." She looked around the living room, at Frank's old recliner, at the framed photos along the mantel, at the soft indent in the carpet where furniture had stood for decades. "Does it ever feel too quiet?" she asked. "Sometimes." "And what do you do then?" "I sit with it." She nodded slowly. "I'm scared of quiet," she admitted. "I know." We held hands for a long moment. "I'm proud of you for staying," she whispered. "And I'm proud of you for leaving," I replied. She laughed through tears. "You always know how to say it gently." "No," I said with a small smile. "I just learned how to say it clearly." After she left that night, I walked through the house again, but this time I did not examine it as if defending it. I walked through it as someone who belonged there without question. In the bedroom, I opened the window slightly. The cool autumn air slipped inside, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves. I lay down on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling. Frank's absence still lived there, but it no longer defined the space. I whispered into the dark. I didn't shrink. And for the first time, the silence felt like agreement. A week later, the moving truck carried Blakely's family out of town. I waved from the driveway. The ache in my chest was real, but it was not regret. It was growth stretching across distance. That evening, Daniel came by again. "You okay?" he asked. "I miss them already," I admitted. But I'm not undone." He smiled faintly. "You've changed," he said. "So have you," he nodded. "I used to think being a good son meant managing everything," he said. "Fixing, arranging, and now I think it means listening." That might have been the greatest shift of all. We sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the trees. "You know," he said casually, "I've been thinking about starting something myself." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, a woodworking class at the community center. Dad would have liked that." "He would have," I said softly. He looked at me. "Maybe this runs in the family." I laughed quietly. "Maybe it does." When he left, I remained on the porch for a long time. The house stood solid behind me, not as a burden, not as an asset, as a choice. My children had started making plans for me because they thought I was nearing the edge. But what they discovered, and what I discovered too, was that the edge wasn't a cliff. It was a doorway. And stepping through it didn't mean surrendering independence. It meant redefining it. I was no longer proving anything. I was simply living deliberately, and that perhaps was the answer they never expected.